is Susie Williams. Susie Williams is a mother. I live in Williamstown, New Jersey. I grew up in Medford most of my life. Moved away from there in my 20s when I got married. I have 2 children, a son who's 23 and a daughter who's almost 21. For myself, probably in early middle school, probably 4th, 5th grade, around that age, I had trouble breathing, more or less playing after school with my friends. I tended to tire easily. It was never diagnosed by a doctor, but I just assumed that I just got tired. I would go home and just rest for a little while, and then I guess when I was probably in 7th or 8th grade is when it was noticed by a doctor when my mother had taken me, that it was diagnosed as asthma. They really didn't use inhalers or anything like that then. It was just really a matter of if you tired easily or you had breathing trouble, it was related to allergies or you're overdoing it. So basically they just always told you to relax. Another thing they would suggest to do was to use like a pot of warm water with steam, that somehow that was going to fix the problem. It did for a minute, and then pretty much it was back again. And then in high school, I guess that's probably where I noticed it the most, doing sports, anything like that, especially running, playing tennis, or running, especially track. That's where I seem to notice it the most. I probably recognized it quicker in my children when they had problems with it. Mine was probably a combination of allergies. I didn't really have bad allergies like pollen until I got a lot older. My asthma actually got worse as I got older. Mine was related more to, I think, sports, running, tiring, pains in the chest, very winded. I didn't really take notice to it because I guess because doctors then didn't diagnose it as asthma unless you were hospitalized for it, then it was a problem.
At some point.
Yeah, in probably my late teen years, that's probably the first time that they started really using inhalers. The nebulizer wasn't something that they really used. I mean, if you needed a nebulizer, you had to be in the hospital to have a nebulizer, versus now you can have one at home. It was very rare when someone had to have an inhaler. I kind of kept mine put away so nobody knew I had it. I don't know why, but that's just how I felt about it. Probably not until in my mid-20s where I really started having a lot of problems with it. More so during allergy season, that seemed to be the worst time. Running after my kids when they were born, that seemed to be a problem too. I probably noticed it first, of course, and mentioning it, I know in gym class it was noticed and sent home, I guess, to my mother and father, because ultimately they took me to the doctor, and I wasn't the kind of kid that was like walking around complaining I couldn't breathe. I had like a lot of allergy problems, so I guess it was directly related to that. That's probably why the doctor said, well, it's asthma that's, what causes the problem. But I don't really recall as to why. It wasn't like I was sent to the doctors because I couldn't breathe. It was probably going and being mentioned enough times that the doctor said, well, this is a problem. My youngest sister, which, she's 10 years difference, growing up had problems with the asthma. My son John, pretty much from the time he was just a few months old, he would get a croup cough. Was very, very wheezy. It's something that I guess he was born with what they call a heart murmur, that they noticed him being very wheezy from the time he was born. That's something that they recognize. They don't really diagnose it as asthma immediately, just he would get what they call croup cough. Like it's kind of like bronchitis in infants, and basically, humidifiers and vaporizers when they're sleeping is ultimately what's used for them. But even by the time he was a year and a half, 2, he still would get a cough or get very wheezy when he would be running around playing. Never stopped him from doing what he was doing. Probably by the time he was 4 or 5 years old was the first time that his doctor introduced the inhaler to him, that ultimately I had to use with him. And his doctor ultimately felt that if using a humidifier in his room when he was sleeping at night, elevating him on a pillow when he's sleeping helped, that was better than using something like a nebulizer, because those treatments, you really have to stay with that kind of treatment. And it didn't seem like it was doing anything for him. His seems to be more related to when he gets sick with a cold. That's when his asthma problems show up. Certain times of the year, mold, that seems to be the thing that triggers it for him. So his is more of an allergy-related asthma problem. He played soccer, he played football, he wrestled. I think probably more than anything was the wrestling, and I don't know if it has to do with the fact that maybe he wasn't breathing correctly or whatever it was when they're wrestling and when they're holding each other. He would tend to get very wheezy when he would get out of breath. Football, he did a lot of running, but whatever position was that he played didn't require him to do a lot of the running. Soccer, he would get a little bit, it would be a little aggravated by pollen on the field, stuff like that. He'd get a little wheezy. Like I said, ultimately, he had more problems when he would get sick with a cold. It would get extreme. He pretty much always had it. Probably not until recent years, and he's 23 now, that he really doesn't use it unless if he's sick, has a cold or anything like that, he seems to get wheezy. My daughter Arielle seems to have more problems year round. It seemed more of a constant problem. Aggravated more, really had trouble breathing. Exercise. So when she was taken to the doctors on that line, she had Arielle's the basic allergies, the itchy eyes, but never. I guess probably maybe 9, 10, somewhere around that time when she got into gymnastics more. Really complained of it, was always a very active child, so ultimately she was diagnosed for what they refer to as exercise-induced asthma, whereas activity is what triggered her problem with it. Hers being more severe in the breathing end of it, really struggling to breathe, and responded well to the inhaler. Didn't have to use a nebulizer, but did have to make sure that she had the inhaler. And I guess she was probably maybe 11 or 12 when they tried the liquid, I can't remember what it's called, the medication that's used supposed to break down the mucus, but that didn't do anything for her, so ultimately we stayed with the inhaler. Well, John's asthma was mainly triggered by activity. If he was running around, especially if like during allergy season or had a cold, he would have more trouble breathing. He could be out on a typical sunny day. If that wind was blowing and there was pollen out there, he would have a little bit of trouble with it. Other than that, I mean, it didn't aggravate him to the point where it was keeping him from doing things. Arielle's was more of a exercise stress related thing. If she gets very stressed, she would have more trouble breathing. Not just in her sport of gymnastics, over exerting herself or whatever would cause a problem, but even in something where she wasn't doing something physical, if she was stressed or get very upset, she would tend to get very wheezy and often have to use the inhaler. The point where her asthma tended to almost make her more sick to her stomach. Sometime it would get so out of control. She never had to use a nebulizer, although, I mean, it might have been something that we could have tried, not something that ultimately she felt was going to make much of a difference for what her problem was. It wasn't a constant thing where she had to get up every day and use a nebulizer. It was triggered by things like stress or overexerting herself.